Okay, good afternoon everyone. We'll make a start. Hopefully we won't be too interrupted by people coming in late, but good afternoon and welcome to Breakout Session A. Thank you for coming and finding us all the way up the long and winding corridors. I just want to introduce myself first of all, and then I'll give a little bit of an introduction to come in, you're welcome. I'll just give a quick introduction to what we're hoping to focus on in this afternoon's session. I'll introduce the speakers, and then we'll hear from each of the speakers, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. So, as you listen through, please do think of questions that will contribute to an ongoing conversation afterwards. Just want to say throughout the session, if you are tweeting or posting anything on any social media at all, please, just as a reminder, to use the hashtag #FuelPovertyConf, which is probably on the screen there. So if you do post anything, please do include that hashtag. So this afternoon's session, the one that you've selected to come to, just to make sure that you're all in the right place, is about finding the right households for priority assistance. So as you know, over the last few years, energy costs have become an increasingly large factor in what contributes to fuel poverty. And whilst that's always been an issue, the energy crisis has seen that become much more of an influential factor in the number of fuel-poor households that we're seeing. And as you know as well, during the peak of the crisis, the government stepped in with universal support, which was kind of necessary at the time, given the severity of the crisis. But obviously, universal support isn't sustainable in the long term. It's very expensive and means that people who don't necessarily need support are getting it. And so this session is really focusing about how we better target the limited number of resources and make sure that the people who need the support most are first in the queue for that support. So this sort of goes back to what Adam mentioned earlier on about supporting the worst first, those whose situations are the worst. How do we make sure that with a limited supply of resources, how do we make sure those resources go to the people who are struggling the most? And in the past, there's been lots of ways lots of proxies that we've tried to use to try to make sure that those resources are targeted, a common one being receipt of means-tested benefits. But in the current state of play, that's not sophisticated enough. That's a very blunt instrument when trying to establish fuel poverty and need. So we need to think in a bit more of a sophisticated way about how we do that. So there's two things really. There's the practical support that is provided to fuel-poor households, and it's really important that that is focused and targeted. And some recent polling that we carried out proves that NEA's targeting of effort and resource is actually matching very well with the areas of need. And we're finding, for example, that low-income households, of course, are struggling, but also older people and those with medical conditions, particularly those who have medical equipment that relies on energy, and also those in the private renting sector as well. But of course, it's not just about the practical assistance and targeting that. The policy that sits behind all of our work needs to be targeted as well if we are successfully to use the limited resources at our disposal to the best effect. So one of those things, for example, we've talked a lot about this morning so far is the Warm Home Discount Scheme, and there are probably lots of ways in which that scheme could be improved to make sure that that targeted bill support goes where it needs to be. And there are lots of factors and lots of data sets available coming into the industry that were perhaps not available to us in years gone by. So one of the focuses of this session is how we use those data sets to really intelligently have a cross-section of all of the data sets that are available to us to enable us to really laser focus that resource where it's needed. So that's hopefully an overview of the kind of things that I'm hoping to cover this afternoon. I'm just going to ask our speakers to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll hear from each of them in turn, and then hopefully we can have a wide-ranging conversation. So, Ben, do you want to go first and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So my name's Ben Pledger. I'm the Deputy Director for Energy Affordability Strategy and Policy in the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. Sorry about the long job title. So I'm one of Miata's civil servants essentially. I think my team's exam question in general is about how can the government get everything it wants to get done this Parliament, particularly the mission on clean power and accelerating to net zero, whilst at the same time getting a fair deal for consumers and lowering bills. I think we've obviously had a very focused discussion this morning around fuel poverty in particular, but my team looks at that overarching commitment to lower bills for everyone over this Parliament, which, as you can imagine, is quite a challenging one in the current context. And then within that, I lead on, I want to kind of policy lead on data within the department as well. So that's why I'm here.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Kate Roberts. I'm Customer Success Director at Switchee. Much easier to say that, really. Switchee is a data and analytics company, and we work directly with social landlords to understand what's going on inside tenants' homes in terms of damp and mould, fuel poverty risk, and lots of other things that I'll talk about a little bit more shortly, but helping them to make data-driven decisions to really help those in social rented homes. I think I'll keep it at that for now to keep us to time.
Hi everybody, Matt James, I head up the policy and innovation team at the DCC, the Data Communications Company. So we provide the technology infrastructure behind the smart meter rollout. And our team's particularly focused on how we can do more with the smart metering system and the data that's being generated, particularly where that aligns with public benefit and meeting key government policy like the challenge of fuel poverty. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Matt. Okay. So you've heard who you're going to hear from now, so hopefully that's given you a kind of introduction and a taster for what's to come. Ben, are you okay to come up and give your presentation now? Thank you.
Thanks very much. And before I say what I was going to say, I just wanted to say something that Miata and Jess Gilback earlier said as well, which is just a big thank you for inviting us, but most importantly just for all the work that you do. The stereotype about us being in Whitehall quite a lot is probably a little bit too accurate for good. So it is kind of great for us to come out here, but also just great to actually meet loads of people doing kind of frontline work that we don't really know about. And the two panelists I've never met before this conference. So it's been a real eye-opener, and it really does matter to us and obviously to the people that you help. So a big thank you from me. I was just going to quickly talk about a few things in the context of the government's take on data. The first one is just lessons learned from the crisis. So this is something that various people have mentioned today, and indeed Nicky did as well in her remarks. But we learned quite a lot of lessons from the crisis. If you take yourself back to 2022, the EBS scheme, the £400 scheme that was paid in 6 instalments, that had started quite early in 2022. The then Prime Minister had announced that, but all of the other measures, the energy price guarantee and all of the business schemes and all of the application schemes were basically all announced in Liz Truss's first speech in September, and most of them started to pay out in October in Great Britain and slightly afterwards in Northern Ireland. So that's incredible pace, and the National Audit Office is very warm towards the government on that, unusually warm for those people that know National Audit Office reports. But as others have said earlier on today, the key behind that success on the data front was this whole trade-off between go quickly and pay everyone, or try and target those most at need and go slowly. And the government, I think, made the right judgment call to go quickly and therefore pay everyone. But as was mentioned earlier, there's a massive price tag to that. I think the latest estimate across all of those schemes is about £43 billion was spent. And as others have said earlier, that could either have, if you were able to target those schemes better, you could have provided more help, or you could have provided help for longer, or indeed you could have just spent less. So a big lesson learned coming out of the crisis there for government, and that government really does lack the data at a macro level really to do anything very sophisticated at all. And then when you go to 2023 and that winter, rather than continue with the schemes, the government chose to use the cost of living payments to support people. And again, that's another group of people that meet certain criteria but doesn't necessarily help everyone that needs it, and I'll expand on that in a second. So that was number one. The second one, which I'm sure we'll talk about a lot as we go along, is automation versus application. So one of the reasons the government schemes were successful was because 99% of people in the country got them automatically without needing to do anything. So your supplier paid you the payment directly and you didn't need to do anything. But in the 1% of people that did need to apply, mainly because they didn't have an energy supplier, so people who live in park homes or people on canal boats or care home residents, in that 1% of people, only 21% of people who were eligible did apply. And that's quite a deep topic that we could probably talk about all day, but one of the lessons learned from that is that automation as much as possible is good. And then the third thing I'd say is just about cross-agency working. So in our case, cross-government working, and we also worked with local government and the devolved administrations. And again, I'm sure another topic we'll talk about a lot today, but data's just held everywhere. And it's quite hard. I'm sure we'll talk about the technical barriers, but it's actually just quite hard knowing what data is where. And the chat we just had beforehand, I didn't know anything that you did, and it sounds like we could really use some of that data in central government. So there's a challenge just about knowing what data is where and how do you get it and how does it help you solve what you're trying to do. The second thing I'll talk about is just our kind of current plan, which Miata talked about this morning. So in November, the government announced that we were going to work with Energy UK and DWP. I should say DESNZ announced we were going to work with DWP, of course, because DWP is part of government. But so government is going to work with Energy UK to make sure that for next winter, more DWP data is available to suppliers so that suppliers can target what they do more effectively. And that's the first step for us on a long journey of data sharing. It's the first step because it's probably the easiest, and if DWP colleagues were here, they wouldn't be happy with me saying that, but it's true, and therefore a lot of the other things we have to do are even more difficult. Miata mentioned the HMRC work, which for us as government officials, I think is right at the heart of the data debate, is that could we reach a position where we're able to target more things on income rather than whether you're on benefits or not. And again, I think you covered that in your opening remarks, Nicky. So we are getting our teeth stuck into that, but that is going to be difficult, depending how geeky the audience is. Like, for instance, what a household is a fascinating debate that you can have hours and hours and hours of discussion on, but is one that really matters and is difficult for some government departments to think about a household in the same way the energy department does. And then, so I think watch this space on HMRC work, and then also, as we covered this morning, the group of people who, through whatever reason, just use lots of energy. So those with long-term health conditions, those on end-of-life care, and how we know who those people are and how we can reach those. As Miata said, we're working with DHSC on a lot of that. But I know if you take the end-of-life care cohort, for instance, that's really difficult, and arguably nobody knows exactly who that group is. And so how can you piece together what different agencies do know about that group? So again, watch this space on DHSC. And then the last two things I'd say, and then I will hand over. One is the really kind of trendy word at the moment in our department, and again, it's quite geeky, is use cases. So understanding much more how data can be used is really important, because then you can start to have those discussions across government about getting the right data. There's obviously a data protection element to that as well, because you're not supposed to use data for the purposes it wasn't intended to be used. So that understanding use cases, and hopefully some of that will come out today, but that's a particular area of work with suppliers at the moment where we're saying to them, if you told us what you could do with more data, we could go and try and get that data for you. And then finally, the last thing I say is just about consent. Consent's a big word in our department at the moment, because the Clean Power mission is a kind of big endeavour, a big mission to get to clean power by 2030, and we want to take energy consumers with us on that journey rather than doing it to them, which is why kind of protecting them and making sure their bills are lowered is an important part of that. And I think consent definitely applies to this data conversation. You know, I talked about the 21% of people who applied for support that they were eligible for. The vast majority of people who didn't actually were for reasons that were out of our, which were in our control and are regrettable. But actually, anecdotally, we were told that some people just didn't want to apply for the funding and they didn't want to interact with government or local government. And I think it is really important that you, through this process, kind of respect that people don't want their data just being moved around different parts of government and the private sector willy-nilly. So yeah, consent's a really important theme, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about that as we go along. But I will hand over to the next person. Kate.
Thank you. I was just saying to one of my colleagues earlier, it's really weird to be in this venue and be sober. But I'm sure I'll change that later on today anyhow. Thanks for that, Ben. Thanks, that was really good to hear. Just by a rough show of hands, can I just get a bit of, and I won't be offended, who knows who Switchee are? Oh, that's all right. That's not bad, actually. About 50%. Great. That means I can explain to the rest of you and it not seem a little bit moot. So Switchee, like I said, are a data analytics company. And what we do is we work directly with social landlords across the UK. We currently work with around 120 landlords. And what we do is we basically have a smart thermostat. So like a hive or a nest goes into a tenant's home with consent. And we are then analysing data that we're collecting through the sensors within that thermostat. So we're looking at temperature, humidity, when the heating goes on, when the heating goes off, hot water, light, pressure. And we're also then adding to that external data, so the weather temperature outside, external humidity, to ensure that we're really getting a richness of information. And then we take that information and we basically analyse it and then produce information for the landlord that will then help inform them as to what they need to do, whether it is risk of damp and mould within the home, risk of fuel poverty for the tenants. It could be around them doing retrofit works, which we'll definitely have lots of conversations about, and whether those interventions that they've put in place are effective. Lots and lots of other examples of how we use it, but those are like the big ones that I feel are relevant for today. What's really important for us is it's not about the things that landlords know, it's the things that they don't know that we really want to surface. And understanding, as today's subject is around who needs support most, actually, you'd be surprised, for those of you who don't work in social housing, just how little landlords do know about their tenants. We saw this a lot when the consumer standards had their big upgrade post-white paper, where there was a lot more information that was being asked around tenants around vulnerability and understanding that, and we're seeing that more again now with our ABS law being introduced. And landlords were overwhelmed by the number of tenants that were reporting that they had a disability. And it was around double what they assumed they had in terms of their data. So understanding who their tenants are is critical, and getting that data and being able to use that in the right way is really important. And we've got some really key examples of this, so some nice use cases. One, for example, where the landlord had said, right, I'm installing Switchee devices in this particular estate. And so we worked with the tenants, we installed the devices. And we noticed that there was a particular address where over 12 months, the tenant had not switched their heating on at all, except for one day, Christmas Day. And so we notified the landlord went out and did a visit, and it turned out this person had never hit their radar. Their rent was paid on time, they never reported repairs, there was no flags that would ever alert them to them. This lady was in her 80s, her benefits were paying directly into her rent. She never reported a repair because she didn't want to bother anyone. She didn't really have issues with her heating because she didn't turn it on. And the reason she'd turned it on Christmas Day was because her grandchildren were visiting and she didn't want them to be cold. That's the kind of stuff that we're doing. We're identifying those people, and off the back of that, she was given so much support and been given advice, and actually now it's a completely different story and her heating's on a lot more often than it was before. But that's the way that you can use data. It's not about what you know, it's about what you don't know. We're really concerned now, we're looking at the amount of information that we've got, and we are concerned about the connection between fuel poverty and damp and mould as well. So our data has proven that those who are in fuel poverty are twice as likely to have damp and mould in their homes. Not really a surprise, is it? At the end of the day, if you're not heating your home, that's going to cause you issues. But we're also seeing that those who are in fuel poverty use their heating 80% less than the national average. So over the period of November to April, the average was to have their heating on for 161 hours. That might sound like a lot, but it isn't. That's literally a couple of hours a week. So this is the issue that we're seeing, and that isn't information that a landlord would know without having a way to source that data. So the other thing that we've noticed is landlords are driven by being able to improve the condition of their properties to EPC-B, etc. However, we are actually more focused on thermal comfort rather than EPC levels, because we're really interested in understanding it's not just about the property, it is about the people that live in that property, and making sure that you're understanding both. Too many times now we are actually seeing properties that are EPC-A and the temperature in that property is less than 18 degrees. That is not an acceptable thing for the people that are living in that property. We're also seeing issues around air source heat pumps. So we've now got over 12 months of data from tenants who have had air source heat pumps installed into their homes, and their bills have trebled. It's not always the solution, and one of the things that you'll hear again and again and again is about understanding what works for both the property and the person, and it not being one single thing is going to fix everything. And some of this around the cost of those bills is because if they've had solar PV installed as well, it will take time for that to pay back. So how are you helping to subsidise that payment? One of the things that we've been doing is we've been working on a warm rents project. So we're working with 3 large landlords, and we're running a pilot where we are basically, with the landlord, subsidising every tenant that has volunteered to be part of this study so that their heating is paid up to 18 degrees C. So the tenant pays nothing up to 18 degrees C, which is the WHO recommendation as to the minimum heating before you start to have adverse health issues. If they want to then pay extra on top of that to have more heating, that's up to them. But these are mainly properties where they have not turned their heating on for a year. So at least having it as some feeling of warmth is better than nothing. And we're always looking at new projects like that. Some of you might have heard, I know I've had quite a few people come up to me at the stand today about our fuel poverty voucher scheme as well. Whilst fuel poverty vouchers are a sticking plaster rather than a solution, they really can help those who are really struggling over winter. So what we've managed to do, because our device, not only is it a thermostat that the tenant has control over, it's also a communication device. So where we're seeing tenants who are at risk of fuel poverty, we're able to send them a message directly through the device, asking them if they're struggling and they need some support. And from there, if they say yes, we can send them a QR code straight onto the device, which then they can download and go and get access to the fuel poverty vouchers immediately. There's no delay, straight away. I know a lot of people will be concerned about whether there's digital exclusion. We also have a paper version of that we can send them if need be, but actually we found that that's been really, really impactful as well. I'm very mindful, am I taking up too much time? So many things to talk about. It's amazing because I'm winging this as well. So I was just taking notes earlier, I should say. It's fine. The other things that we've been finding, so one of the things is, for example, we have seen 2 properties that are like-for-like examples where literally there is nothing different. They're operating their heating in the same way in both properties. However, one is colder than the other. And for the reason for this is one has floor coverings and the other doesn't. So again, some of the work that we're doing is going to be hopefully feeding into the Decent Home Standard as that's being reviewed at the moment. And these are the kinds of pieces of information that we can share. But for us, we need to bring data together. It isn't just about what Switchee can do, it is about what we can do collectively with energy providers, with other organisations that are gathering data as well. We are collecting smart meter data with the tenant's consent at the moment, but we know that as the organisations that understand this data, we have a responsibility to help those who need that data to get it in the right way and collectively work together to do that. We are also noticing there's some other key things around that behaviour as well about how tenants are operating their homes. One of the interesting things that we've found is when retrofit measures are put into tenants' homes, there is a lot of information that's given to the tenant at the time that that stuff is put into their home. So new heat pump, solar panels, new insulation, etc., etc. First of all, that's a lot of information for anyone to take on at once. And actually, it should be a regular check-in. And so part of the work that we do, where we're tracking, is actually whether the tenants are using the home in the way that you would expect them to. And then we can provide communication information and advice through the device as well. But the other thing is, what we notice there's a big gap in is that when that tenant moves out and another tenant moves in, that same information isn't given to the new tenant. And that same kind of conversation is not happening. There's just an assumption that they'll know that information. So in understanding what information needs to be out there and how you communicate with tenants is really critical as well. We also see a lot of tenant blaming. And actually, we're able to observe from the data that we've got that it is the issue around the property a lot of the time that is causing the problem. Heat loss rate is massive. Time to heat is massive, and we measure this information to actually inform landlords better. When they're telling us that they've got tenants that are really struggling with their fuel and they don't turn the heating on, we can go, actually, they turned it on for 8 hours, and guess what? It dropped within an hour because you haven't put insulation in that property. But it's the tenant's fault that they can't heat their home. And it's that information that's really important, understanding how that home operates. But the other thing is being careful with that as well. I don't know if there's any social landlords in here, but I worked in social housing for around 15 years, and I started off as an apprentice painter and decorator at an arm's length management organisation in Oldham. And I remember it was just after double glazed PVC units got put into all of the properties. And that was when we started to see issues with damp and mould, because we were hermetically sealing the properties, and actually it was creating all the condensation and humidity, and actually that became a real problem. We are starting to see the same issue around insulation again now. Properties are being insulated, and we're able to prove that the levels of humidity and the risk of damp and mould are higher in those properties than they are in the ones that are not being retrofitted. So we need to be careful, and we need to monitor that, and we need to understand how we can be strategic about understanding archetypes and operation, having really decent ventilation strategies, because you need to vent as much as you insulate, and making sure that we're really understanding that and sharing that information. We're also seeing a lot more issues around overheating. It seems weird to be talking about that in winter, but overheating is a significant issue. And we are seeing more and more tenants being at risk of heat stroke every year now. We are getting it up. The world is getting warmer, and all of this insulation on top is not helping too. So we need to be conscious. But the challenge that we have in housing sometimes is, and I've mentioned this earlier to Ben, we're very good at sharing when we do something well. We're not so good at sharing when things go wrong. And we need to be learning those lessons, and we need to be helping other landlords to learn those lessons too before they make the same mistakes. We're definitely seeing that fuel poverty is flatlining, and I know that was mentioned in one of by one of the speakers earlier. We have one of the largest landlords in the UK who has been very lucky in being granted the SHDF funding every wave so far, and they still have as many fuel poverty cases today as they did do when they had their first round of funding. And they are working their asses off to do what they can do, but we all need more, but we all need to understand how we can do this better. And data and people is how we do that together. Thank you.
It is great to be here today. There's been some really fascinating perspectives and insights already. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the areas in which the smart metering system and smart meter data can help to identify financial difficulty and fuel poverty. It's probably worth just starting with a quick intro to who DCC are. We're not the most well-known of organisations, I think it's fair to say. But so as a quick background, we're a licensed monopoly. We were set up back in 2013 to design, deliver and now manage the technology infrastructure behind the smart meter rollout. We work with a range of service providers to provide secure end-to-end transmission of data from devices in people's homes, smart meters, back to organisations that use our system. So that's predominantly energy suppliers and distribution networks, but actually any organisation who goes through the kind of onboarding and accreditation process can draw back data from the meters in people's homes. So what we're seeing is a whole range of organisations are now going through that and developing really innovative products and services. You know, Switchee is a great example. The rollout is about 65% of the way there now. So there's over 20 million homes connected to the network. And we're still seeing over 12,000 additional homes connected every day. So really the trajectory is very much in the right direction. There's actually about 500 different types of messages and alerts that can be sent to and from connected devices in the home. And so given the number of connected homes, the number of messages, we're actually seeing over 3 billion data transactions across the system every month. Don't want to get too far into the detail with the data, but I think it's worth just touching on some of the data that is available, because it's very, very relevant to this conversation. When smart metering comes up, people automatically jump to consumption data. You know, how much energy is a household using? And that's really valuable in context with understanding, you know, financial difficulty and fuel poverty, spotting where households are self-rationing, underheating homes. But there's actually another category of data which we call system data. And really that's all of the transactions that take place across the network. So those 3 billion data points that I mentioned earlier. That data sits centrally on our systems. And we primarily look at that to monitor the performance of the end-to-end communications network. But we've been working for quite some time now on how we open that data up in the right way, where that can deliver more public benefit, and particularly in context with fuel poverty. So some of the insights that can be identified and inferred from that system data include things like, you know, firstly, and this is perhaps quite obvious, but whether or not people have a smart meter. Understanding which areas there is a lower than average rate of take-up. And that might be driven by property typologies, it might be demographics or geographies where there is just simply a lower level, you know, underrepresented examples in terms of the rollout. So understanding where smart meters are helps to understand where they aren't and what tactics, what campaigns can be put in place to increase the rate of rollout. Secondly, from the system data, we can see to a degree how engaged consumers are with the energy system. So looking at things like when was the last time they changed supplier, when was the last time they changed tariff, are they actually accessing the most cost-effective deal for them. And then thirdly, and probably most relevant in terms of this conversation, what we see is an audit trail of all of the prepayment meter transactions that take place across the network. So that's how frequently households top up, but also things like when a meter is operating in low credit, or indeed where a household have exhausted all of the credit on the meter and have actually self-disconnected from the system. So we know that on average households top up every 6 days. So as you start to see patterns of increasing frequently, you know, topping up, dipping into low credit, and indeed exhausting all of that credit, you can start to draw conclusions about the likelihood of financial difficulty within particular households. A couple of key points to make. We're absolutely not under the impression that data is a silver bullet. It's clearly a valuable part of the jigsaw, but it requires other data to confirm some of the insights and the likelihood of financial difficulty being evident. There's a few characteristics that help, that improve the quality of the data further though. Firstly, it's dynamic. We know that financial difficulty is a hugely transient issue. People can very quickly get into financial difficulty. That's clear. So a key advantage of the data that it's near to real time. It's refreshed multiple times a day. So some of those changes in situation that just don't get picked up in statistics, that they're not so evident in things like the indices of multiple deprivation, can come through in smart meter data. It's also temporal. The data goes back several years since the very start of the smart meter rollout. So that allows the ability to spot the impact of seasonality, the impact of really cold weather spells, but also things like changes in policy, price cap changes. We can see quite clearly within the data some spikes when the price cap is put into place, and that has a knock-on effect as you might anticipate, really. And then it's also a fully geographic data set, so it's GB wide, and as might be expected, there is quite a bit of disparity across Great Britain. So, for example, at a borough level, the rate of prepayment meter installs varies from just 2% in some of the most affluent areas, right up to 25% in some of the most deprived areas. So that's kind of the data available. What we've been working on is where and how that can help. And we've been trying to open this up for quite a while now. And so with the support of Ofgem, with approval from Ofgem and the backing of several energy suppliers, we're now actually currently sharing some of that system data in an anonymised form with several organisations. So that's predominantly charities, local authorities, but some other organisations as well. And really they're using that to understand consumer needs better and then enhance the accuracy and impact of fuel poverty intervention schemes that they're delivering. So just as a couple of examples, one of the organisations, a company called Urban Tide, so they've been using the data working with the net zero energy hubs. So these are government-funded agencies that help to deliver energy efficiency schemes. They've been using the data as part of a model to help identify opportunities to deploy the home upgrade grant. And they've seen a huge increase in the number of referrals since the inclusion of the data within this model. We're also working closely with the Greater London Authority and the Greater Manchester Combined Authority as well. So again, they're using that data to support their fuel poverty intervention schemes, but also looking at things like local area energy planning. To what degree are boroughs able to, are ready for the kind of energy system transition and making sure that consumers can benefit. And then just one other project, again, so working with one of the networks, the Scottish and Southern Electricity Network in partnership with Aberdeen Council and a charity called Quarriers. Again, the data fed into a model alongside a range of other data sets of property, financial health actually in this situation. And that model is designed to identify vulnerability in particular areas and then provide support where it was most needed. So I think the potential of that data is really quite clear, but we have a huge amount of demand over and above those organisations that are currently accessing the data. And what that needs to kind of drive it forwards further is really even more collaboration, both within the sector and beyond, really. We're trying to get increased support from energy suppliers. There are several more that we'd really like to participate with this initial scheme, and moving towards more of a kind of data exchange model. Finding the way to join the dots between local authorities and energy suppliers is really where we see great opportunity to drive further impact. So just in summary then, really, smart meter rollout has very much hit scale, 20 million homes now connected and growing. It's really quite a unique data set that when used appropriately can deliver some really valuable insights that can help people in difficult situations. I think we've started to prove that value through collaboration with a number of organisations, but there's a huge amount more that we can do. So we're really keen to keep pushing. So,
well, huge thanks to all of our speakers. That was a really, really interesting session. It's great to see that you've learnt already from speaking to each other about data sets that you weren't aware of already. So that's conference working and doing its thing already before we've done anything else. So that's great. It's really good to hear some more detail behind what the Minister's mentioned this morning and the sort of nuts and bolts of that. So thanks, Ben. And the other two speakers, you've given us examples of really good windows into data that we otherwise wouldn't see. And it's just a really, really powerful tool. I mean, I knew about both things, but listening to what you said, it just gives us such a lot of data and such a lot of power to make change as a result of that. So I guess really the challenge for us all now is how we really maximise on that data, which, as I said at the beginning, is new to us, relatively speaking. Like 20 years ago, this kind of data would have been unimaginable. So how do we use that? How do we maximise on that to get the resources to where they need to go? One of the things that Ben said at the beginning, I think, really highlights the challenge of this. So you can go fast and dirty, and you can go universal, and you can pay everybody, or you can provide resource to everybody. And one of the really good things about that is it gets to everybody. But that challenge between automation versus application, it was really stark when you said that the very small proportion of people who had to apply for that universal support, a very, very small percentage of that proportion did actually apply. So the challenge is we need to target the resource where it needs to go, but also make it as automatic as possible, because it's the application process seems to be where things fall down, and people who are vulnerable and people who are dealing with all sorts of other issues in their lives are often the ones that don't apply and therefore miss out, even though they fall within the targeted groups. So I think that's the challenge that we all need to think about. But thank you very much to all of our speakers. We've got about half an hour left of the session. I'd like to throw it open to questions from the floor. Does anybody want to kick off? Yes. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you. Just a quick question. It was probably more for Ben. Do you see any ways in which energy companies' priority services data could be used for targeting of government energy support schemes? I know there's a lot of challenges, but is it something that's been discussed in any way or thought about?
I'm not going to fess up which stand I picked this pen up from, but it doesn't work. So,
Do you want to have that one?
yeah, thanks. That was about the Priority Service Register. Was it? So I didn't see who said that.
Yes, sorry. So it was whether that data from the priority services registers could be used in any way for targeting of government support schemes, or how that would even be feasible.
Yeah, it's a very good question and an important piece of work, I think. So the Priority Service Register work we've engaged with quite a lot. I think it has the usual issues with any data set around kind of coverage and reliability, so you have to be careful how you use it, but not to contradict some of my earlier messaging, but I actually also think you mustn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, which is why on our DWP project we are working with being able to give suppliers more data so that they have got a much more granular sense of what they can do with not just their own money, but just you know, their support, their advice, etc. So I definitely agree it's a you know, a good source of data and a good opportunity.
Are there sort of data consent issues with that?
I suspect it matters. It kind of depends how you go about it. So I think if you're the supplier with that data that's been self-declared to you, and we as government are giving you DWP data, for instance, on who's on which means tested benefits, that's one thing. I think a project where you try to match things across suppliers and create one database that everyone can use, I think that does run you into some of those consent issues. So I think it probably depends which way you kind of try and come about the problem.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, just very quickly.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Just to build on that, I think some of the work we've been doing, we do see opportunities for data to flow back from some of the organisations using the smart metering system data I talked about, back to energy suppliers with the opportunity to actually ensure that they can keep the priority services register more up to date and more accurate. So I think that ability to enable data exchange is really important. And equally, there are things in the smart meter system data which can help to enhance the priority services register. So we see visibility of when households change tenancy. So, you know, just that accuracy within the PSR, I think, can be taken forward further. And just one final point would be that there ought to be possibility of ensuring that households don't need to re-register on the PSR every time they change supplier, which seems to be currently the case. So again, the technology with things like Ofgem's faster switching program is there. So they really ought to be able to find a way to kind of transfer that information about PSR from supplier to supplier without that need to re-register. There are challenges from a data privacy perspective, but they shouldn't be insurmountable, really.
Okay, thank you. I saw an absolute forest of hands go up then. Just here, yeah. Oh, you've got the microphone
Yes,
already.
I do.
Go for it.
Hi, probably another question for Ben. I'm Maddie from Mencap, we're a learning disability charity. We're really interested in this whole idea of targeting support because people with learning disability are particularly vulnerable to health conditions that are worsened by cold homes. Caroline Flint mentioned earlier on the central panel the potential of using NHS data, for example, using annual health checks that people with a learning disability receive from their GP every year. So I just wanted to get your thoughts really on that use of generally NHS data and DWP data to really specifically target support to people who are really the most vulnerable. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we absolutely want to do it. I think Miata said that earlier, and I think she even said she's meeting the health minister tomorrow on this. So we're kind of serious about it. I think when we've engaged with NHS data before, it's probably another topic on the long list of data topics. It's something about kind of reliability, accuracy. I didn't say it in my PSR answer, but in the past, that's a problem we've had with PSR is it's self-declared and different suppliers have different barriers, kind of different criteria. So there's all that kind of thing. There's also kind of leadership issues, I think, with the health system. It's such a fragmented system with lots of different agencies and how you kind of get that engagement at the highest level. But it's absolutely something that we do want to do. And then we are quite interested in, other than NHS data, what else is out there to help us with this question about long-term health conditions and other conditions that might lead you to need to use more energy than the typical user.
Okay, thank you. It was certainly very positive to see that the departments are sort of talking to each other on these kind of issues. And as we know, fuel poverty is a massively cross-cutting issue. So great to see that happening. At the back there in green.
Hi, thank you. Some great presentations there, and it's fantastic to hear the way that you're using data and those conversations that are happening with DWP. I know that that's been a notorious lock and key for many, many, many years. So I'm Fiona from Beat the Cold. We operate as a fuel poverty charity in Staffordshire, and we are, I think, only the second trust in the UK to be using NHS data. We've actually got that in the hands of the charity, so it can be done, and it's very, very positive and helping us to reach the right people. My question really is around the DWP data. So I work really closely, we're commissioned by 9 local authorities, and they're always very keen to link in with DWP, but notoriously can't get that data. And as to whether there would be any opportunity, or if it's something that can be considered at least for local authorities to tap into that DWP data to target them for the right support with something like Warm Homes Local Grant, for example.
I think that's... Does anybody other than Ben want to respond to that one? No, I think that... Sorry, Ben, that is, you're going to have to field that one again.
That's
sorry.
all right. I totally don't identify with the comments about DWP, civil servants, obviously. I think it's probably a good use case example, because I think something I didn't cover in my presentation, because it got the risk of being a bit too techie, but is legislation. So as government, we kind of have to legislate to share data, and you have to be very specific about the purposes of that, and parliamentary time is scarce, so you kind of have to know exactly what you're asking for and what you're doing. So I think the answer to the question is probably it's absolutely technically possible. but would be keen to talk to you separately about exactly how that would work. I inferred from the question it was partly about the delivery of some of the energy efficiency schemes, in which case, absolutely. On my job, I tend to come at it through the financial support, social tariff lens, because that's what I lead on as well. But we are working with colleagues, in fact, I think some of them are in the audience here, on how you could use that more generally across the energy system, not just on financial support.
Great, thank you. Just to give Ben a little bit of respite, does anybody have a question for Kate or Matt? Sophie?
Yes,
just hold fire for the mic, please.
Be loud enough. Yeah, so a question for Kate and probably Matt as well. So one of the big things that we really struggle with at NEA is communal heating. It is the bane of our life. When we get one of those phone calls, we all go, oh, because we don't really know how to deal with it. Is Switchee being used in communal heating systems? Can it be? Are smart meters going to be prepared to deal with that? You've got someone sitting at 30 degrees sweating and someone else in a flat below sitting freezing because they're too scared the bill's going to go up this year that they're paying their percentage of, and it just seems very unfair. So any views on that?
Well, yeah, communal heating is a pain in the arse. In terms of Switchee, we can still collect the data, but the control depends on what control they have already, really, and it doesn't really change in that sense. But at least it means that you can track that information to understand, is it genuinely getting too hot? And I think this is the information we're really keen on talking about, which is about how different properties can be impacted differently by a single temperature. If you're on the top floor, we know heat rises, that's actually really unbearable. And we had a really interesting example of this with a particular supported housing provider that we were working with. And they, all of the people that lived in the properties all had carers. And the housing provider themselves paid for the heating. They paid all the utility bills. And they came to us and they were like, we want to be able to cap the heating temperature at a certain level because they are whacking it up and it's so hot and, it's costing us an absolute arm and a leg. What can you do? So we looked at temperature capping, but we said we wanted to really explore a little bit more around what was going on in the property. So we decided to put a pin lock onto the thermostat, which the carer could access if they needed to. And what we discovered, it was the carers that were whacking up the heating, not the tenants. Quite a few of the carers had moved to the UK from much warmer climes and were literally at 2 o'clock in the morning turning the heating up to 30 degrees. We were able to use the evidence from that to show that actually they were putting tenants' lives at risk. And we gave the landlords, first of all of the information and gave them 2 recommendations. One, either retrain the care staff that they paid for separately of a different company, or remove that care staff because they were going to kill their tenants. We were very lucky that the care staff did actually take on the training instead. We went and we actually were able to educate them on even simple things like opening windows when it's hot, which they were surprised at and hadn't thought of. But the conditions in those properties were unbelievable. One of our staff members went to walk up the stairs to one of the top floor properties, and she said the air was thick. She could barely breathe the heat in there. So, yeah, unfortunately, kind of a long-winded way of saying there are certain restrictions with communal heating, but it can give you the evidence to then inform what decisions you make out of that.
Yeah, I'm a little bit out of the loop in terms of communal heating. I guess way back, I remember there being sort of potentially metering regulations emerging for heat networks. But yeah, not sure where that got to. I guess one point to make though, the smart metering network is a communications network that can support a wide range of applications beyond just energy metering. So yeah, I don't know whether heat metering is still on the cards, but it is something that could potentially be supported through the system.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Cheers. This question's for Kate and Matt, really. I was wondering, with a lot of the analysis that you're doing of all the data you're getting, have you found any sort of households or criteria that are revealing priorities that aren't traditionally expected? Like, are there any emerging trends that you're noticing in this regard?
So I think one of the advantages of the smart metering data is the breadth and depth of it. We as DCC don't tend to do that kind of analysis ourselves. Our role is about making sure that organisations can have access to that data in the right way to really kind of undertake that detailed analysis. So that's kind of the angle that we come at this from. One thing I would say is that I think there's some research by the Fuel Bank Foundation which identified that one of the demographics that is most likely to be perpetually in fuel poverty are younger households, so 18 to 30. And that's perhaps surprising to many. But so I think that there are the ability to kind of interrogate data and understand more, do that kind of segmentation to a greater effect is really important. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a really good question. I suppose it's more because our thing is about that hidden voice and understanding actually what don't you know. I think it's more that we're finding the barriers and those challenges as to why people either aren't heating their home or where the ones are that are most at risk of damp and mould are kind of the ones that we're really focusing on. So first one being the biggest challenge of those residents where English isn't a first language. It is a huge barrier. It is a huge barrier, and that comes from so many different aspects, whether it is that the instructions on how to operate things are not in a language that they're comfortable with, to they actually have a fear about contacting their landlord because they don't feel that they can speak well in their own language or in English. And that's a massive, massive barrier, a huge barrier. And then the other one that we find quite often is the shame issue. And we see this again and again and again around tenants who, like, where they have mould in their homes, they're embarrassed about it, so they don't want to report it. And it comes down to, as well, in terms of asking for help because of that for anything. So even if they're at risk of fuel poverty, they won't contact their landlord because they're fearful that they're going to come round to their house and they're embarrassed in the condition that property is in. We also see that with tenants who have come from the private rented sector who were evicted under Section 21, where they were evicted through no fault of their own, but had been complaining or reporting things to their landlord. These tenants are highly unlikely to contact their landlord about anything. And so building that trust is really, really important. And that's why if you are the one that's being proactive as a landlord and going out and reaching out to those people, that's where it makes a massive difference. But there's no real surprises in terms of those who are at risk. I agree in terms of the age range. We see it time and time again, actually, young people who have left care and come into social housing, they massively struggle, and young parents as well, real issue. There's just no money there. So, you know, it has to be that we challenge our own assumptions is the way that we talk about it. Don't assume you know who's vulnerable. You need to be driven by information, and we prefer not to use data. We say intelligence. So, like, it has to be informed data. So actually all of the pieces put together is what should give you that information about who's vulnerable.
Thank you. I think both of those comments really underline the fact that it's all well and good having the data, but the data itself doesn't actually solve anything. The intelligence doesn't make the problem go away. It just means that there's some spreadsheet somewhere. The key is obviously what we do with that data and allowing that to drive action. So thank you. We've got a few more minutes for some more questions. Crikey, there's like, oh, yeah, go for it.
Sorry, Ben, you're back on the pitch, mate. Just a quick question. On the PSR register, we're a charity that looks after people with learning disabilities, and we've had all the bills put into our name to try to protect the clients, which means we can't access the PSR register because we're classed as a corporate entity. So it would just be to make you aware of that, and there are organisations like us set up to protect the vulnerable, but by being a corporate, we end up on a corporate tariff, as well, which means we pay more. And also we can't access some of the services that are set up for the people that we look after, which are mainly those with learning disabilities or dual disabilities.
Thank you.
Yeah, if there's something specific I can do to help, I'll gladly talk to you afterwards about that. As one of my reflections on the communal heating question actually is the what is a household thing. Those people will be on commercial tariffs in all likelihood as well, and that was part of the reason that drove the low take-up is most of these people in the example I used at the beginning would be on commercial tariffs and therefore don't interact with the energy company. So very happy to talk to you afterwards. I think PSR sits in the business department, but I can certainly take it away and see what we can do.
That would be great, thank you. I wasn't aware of that, so useful information, and hopefully there's a solution at hand. Thank you. Okay, at the back there.
Hi, I'm Mary Shaughnessy from Caden Gas. There's a lot of discussion around a public health approach, but I think what we're finding is a lot of the time is those who are most in difficulty want to go to somebody that they know, somebody they trust. And we've just started up a hub in Liverpool in a school, and we've got all the public health, we've got the dental service and everybody around. It's very new. But what we're finding is that people are walking in off the street and saying, sitting down for a cup of tea, but actually then telling somebody about their problems, which tend to be interconnected. So how do we match the data with an actual physical person on the ground who can then pick up, act on that data, and actually help people to resolve the issues?
Okay, does anybody want to take that one first?
I think totally agree with your comments. From our perspective, as I mentioned earlier, we're trying really hard to find a way to get some of the smart metering data out to frontline charities. And we've had some great support from energy suppliers who are ultimately the kind of data holders, if you like, to do that. So I think just finding a way to as I said, to get that data to organisations that can provide that face, that interaction is totally agree, really important.
I suppose from my perspective, I'm working directly with landlords, and that the important thing is that their frontline staff have that information. And I do find it interesting that when I hear about a lot of different practices and activities that are happening, so what energy suppliers are doing in trying to target those who are most vulnerable, I've seen it with healthcare a dozen times. Actually, housing doesn't always get considered to be put into the loop of that information, and that is extremely frustrating for every landlord that is trying to understand the people that are living in their homes and are perfectly positioned to give them a lot of that support or to be the signposters for the right support. So I don't have an answer in that sense, but what I would say for anyone in this room that is looking at initiatives that you're running, just ask yourself, is this a social tenant? Is there a landlord that actually would join up the work that we do, and we can pool resources and have a single version of truth, and also ensure that the right support is going to the right people? Because the amount of times that things are being duplicated by different organisations is crazy. And I love the fact that we're seeing health and housing sort of getting together and sharing a lot of initiatives. However, it's very pepper potted, and it's one of the biggest frustrations that there are about 1 million research papers out there that all recommend that health and housing should work better together. I mean, I go back to many years ago when we used to just have a health and housing minister. And so it's really, really important that we find ways to put those two together at a much higher, large-scale level, because we know how intrinsically they are connected and how important both of those things are.
Mine, I think, is also not quite an answer, but an observation. I think one element probably none of us have covered is like big data. Yours probably does a bit of it, but and it's not my expertise, which is why it's not an answer, but the Department for Science and Innovation will be doing loads of stuff on big data. We always talk about AI, but I don't even mean that. I mean things like digital IDs and digital passports and how you can have all your information in one place. I think ONS are looking at removing the 10-year paper census on the basis there's all sorts of data collected about us all the time via different agencies, and if you could all just put that in one place, you'd know a heck of a lot more than you would by asking people every 10 years. So that's, I say it's not an answer, because I'm not quite sure how it would be applied to that example, but I think it is an opportunity.
That does sort of come back to the issue of consent, really, and I wondered if people have comments about the ways in which we can convince households that sharing this kind of data is in their best interest in the long run. Does anybody have examples either of when you've come across resistance from householders when it's come to the issue of data sharing, or examples of where you've managed to convince people that it is worthwhile? Bill?
About 10 years ago, we worked with the CCG before they became whatever they are now. Yeah, and we had to put a case forward to them to say that you're putting these people more at risk by not allowing us to share, not allowing the data to be shared with us to provide them with heating to keep them warm and well, than if you don't share it with us. So it's that sort of, it's in the interest of the house, it's in the best interest of that. And we actually got approval from the CCG consultants that were looking at this process to see whether or not that was an acceptable thing to do. And we did it. And unfortunately, we went through primary care GP practices, and that didn't really work very well. But we ended up with social care in the end, which was a much better approach to finding people that are vulnerable. We haven't really talked about owner-occupiers very much either, but they make up the vast majority of your, of your population. And I would be interested, Kate, to know whether or not you'd actually put one of your systems into an individual householder who isn't in a landlord property. And is it expensive? You haven't really talked about cost. Thanks.
I'm not here to sell. By all means, come and have a chat with us on the stand downstairs, and we can talk about that. We at the end of the day, Switchee, our mission is to help those people living in rented homes. So we are not adverse to doing individual landlords if that's the way it wants to be. The level of richness of data you're going to get from just a couple of properties isn't going to be the same, but certainly that support's there as well. In response to examples of that resistance, I mean, you can imagine working in social housing, that's like the big challenge is encouraging tenants to basically have, first of all, a new technological device installed into their home. There's a lot of paranoia around monitoring. And then, actually having them engage with that. And I think one of the best examples of that was there's a particular housing provider, one of our customers, who specialises in housing veterans. And you've never come up against the most resistant bunch when it comes to monitoring devices, because you can imagine their kind of experiences that they've had of tracking and monitoring. And actually, we found that just ensuring that they helped to shape the conversation that we had with residents, unpicking those fears, understanding why they were fearful around it, and then giving them the assurance that they needed, and being transparent about what was happening, and putting the control in their hands in terms of, if at any point this doesn't feel comfortable for you, we will stop. Completely transformed actually their belief and their assumption, and we see this time and time again with tenants, whether it's retrofit measures or anything else. It is about effective communication. It's not about using lots of technical jargon. It's about being able to have an honest, human, open, face-to-face conversation with an individual and allaying those fears. But it's also being accepting that if someone is just not willing for it to happen, accept that and move on. And it's as simple as that. But we see it, like with the Hague example, those tenants now, so we managed to do a huge install. We're now at, coming up to 100% installation in all of their properties. Their tenants now shared videos on our website and everything about how awesome it is and what they love about it. And we've absolutely turned their lives around. One of the things that landlords have is on an annual basis, they do an annual tenancy visit if they can. And for this particular landlord, they would send out a letter about a month in advance, basically saying, we're going to come around on this day, this time, we're going to visit. And they used to have like about 40% access rates for that. And that's really costly, not only just sending out the letters to everyone, but actually having to revisit the time of staff doing that just to understand. And the annual tenancy visit, the whole reason is to make sure that you're gathering the right data, having up-to-date information on your tenants. So instead, for this particular year, we put the information onto the Switchee device, and we said it's going to be this time, this day, are you going to be in? Yes, no. They could actually schedule their own appointment. And then off the basis of that, we had 98% access rate. So they went from 40% to 98% just from something simple that actually cost them a significant amount less. But it's that communication and keep on communicating with them until they are comfortable and they are assured of the information that's being shared.
Okay, thank you. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, just very quickly, there's also a quite technical angle to all this, which is the government can actually share data if it's for the specific purpose of alleviating fuel poverty under the Digital Economy Act. So as per the discussion in the main hall, that the technical definition then matters, because if you tried to do something that was, for instance, targeting financial support at people with certain medical conditions from the question earlier, you might not be able to do that because that doesn't fit the narrow definition of fuel poverty. So there is a definitions point as well that we're trying to solve as well through our work.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, at the back there. Getting your steps in today, Brian.
Thanks. I'm Martina Cavan from Nesta. I have a question for Ben, but also, well, actually anyone, which is whether you have a view on how you would change the targeting of financial support for fuel-poor households if all the current problems with the data sharing were magically solved.
That's a good question. Anybody want to take that one first?
I'll give the longer answer. I don't know if anyone wants to give a shorter one.
You go first. Go on, you
I mean, it's a great question, and it's worth its own conference alone, social tariff. So I won't give the very long answer because it would literally last for hours. I think just to give you a flavour of some of the things we're thinking about in the department on this question, I think one is around, so we talk a lot about the who, so I won't go into that too much because I think we've kind of covered that here, but which cohorts of people are you looking at? One of the ones we don't really talk about here, because it's not so much a data or fuel poverty type conversation, but is important, is the type of support. So the warm home discount is a £150 rebate that's paid usually early on in the winter. There's other ways of doing that. You could do a kind of volumetric per unit subsidy that would be spread across the whole year. There's, for geeks like me, rising block tariffs where you get a block of energy at a lower price or even free, and then the next block costs more, and that incentivizes everybody to use a bit less, etc. So there's all sorts of design questions on that. I think at some point, as per what Miata was saying, we are working on this as a department. We hope to be able to ask some of these questions publicly and see what everyone thinks about some of those topics. So I think I won't go back through the who should get it, but that will be another kind of key part of the decision making around this.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think from a smart metering perspective, again, without going back into the who and eligibility, but there is data there that can help to support with that kind of consideration. I think the other factors that we'd like government and Ofgem to think about in terms of potentially a future social tariff are some of the other capabilities of the smart metering system. So things like the ability to provide credit direct to the meter. So we know that with the Energy Bill Support Scheme, for example, households with smart prepayment meters benefited because credit could be automatically updated onto the meter, whereas households with an analog meter had to go and claim that voucher, and quite a lot of money was actually left unclaimed. So that ability, sits there, and I think is an important one to consider as part of any future arrangement. The same capability is also there to potentially automatically transfer households onto a particular tariff. So again, we think that's a capability that should be considered. And then just the final point, there are some innovative projects going on at the moment which are demonstrating how things like temperature and humidity data could also be backhauled through the smart metering system. So there's lots of component parts there that combined could come together to underpin quite a significant change, whether that's a social tariff or other really.
I suppose just the couple that one that I mentioned earlier, which was warm rents, and for us, like, warm rents is fantastic. We've seen it in other countries that it's really worked. So being able to kind of help landlords to subsidise that everyone has a home that's heated to a minimum of 18 degrees would be wonderful. And the other one is there's another project that we're just getting involved in at the moment, which is Zero Bills, which is a fantastic project where basically all properties will have all of the retrofit works or even new builds having solar power, and then they have like the battery storage that basically it's paying for itself. However, there's a big cost for the landlord there. So being able to increase the rent slightly would then actually allow them to subsidise the cost of that. So but the problem with that is then that has a massive impact on housing benefit and actually how much is being paid if you're increasing rent. So finding some financial solutions and using that money in a different way that will then actually just mean that tenants are no longer paying bills, full stop, rather than just trying to temporarily tackle the issue around fuel poverty is kind of really important, I think.
Okay, thank you. That's a really thought-provoking point I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap things up now. It feels like we have literally just scratched the surface and we could easily have, a whole day or a whole conference on the kind of issues that we've talked about today. But thank you again to all of our speakers for giving us some really, really interesting and inspiring insight. I hope that this session has been the beginning of lots of other conversations that will now continue, both over the next few days in Liverpool, but also beyond that as well. So please do use the next half hour to grab people and network. There is a refreshment break now, so please do make your way back to the main area. Teas and coffees will be served, and then the final session begins at 4 o'clock. So once again, thank you very much to you all for your questions and to our speakers.